Chapter 39. Believe it or not, it all began with that stupid kids show, The League of Ladybugs. Well, with the TV show and with John Henry Knox. But first things first. Just before The League of Ladybugs got canceled, in the very last episode to ever grace the airwaves, a band of pretty polka-dotted insects took on its most troublesome problem yet. They went to battle with a gang of mechanical, motorized, and probably most disturbingly for the bright red, incessantly cheery bugs, utterly emotionless beetles. These creatures weren't kind. They weren't considerate. They didn't know how to share. For them, friendship was something strange, silly, and even dumb. Of course, the hyper-friendly and always ready to share with others ladybugs were horrified. And when the robotic beagles began to eat all their food without a simple please or thank you, well, that right there was the last straw. The ladybugs were going to have to, wait for it, teach the beetles some basic manners. Can you believe Dan actually liked this stuff? Ugh. Anyway, that's the last part of the episode that really matters, because the seed was planted in Dan's brain. He started thinking about robots, and got me to start thinking about them too. We even built a few things, like this little four-wheeled Lego craft that could set up and knock down 30-foot-long rows of dominoes all by itself. I thought it was all pretty nifty, but soon enough I moved on to something else. I think, actually, that was when my grandpa sent me that build-it-yourself wind tunnel. But Dan didn't move on. Somehow he decided that he could build an even bigger, better robot, and that he could do it without any of my help. So he started doing research, reading, experimenting, dreaming. He did all this during the afternoons that the League of Ladybugs used to air. He knew I'd have no interest in hanging out with him then. And he didn't feel so bad about lying to me, seeing as the idea for the robot was at least inspired by the now canceled TV show. You know, the one I ragged on every chance I got. Now, cut to a few months later, which was when John Henry Knox started telling all of us engineers about the bizarre, unprecedented weather patterns he'd been noticing, and how it very well might mean the end of the world as we knew it. Dan, being Dan, freaked out. There was a lot of lip gnawing going on at this time. One thing that John Henry Knox was always babbling on about was food, the need to manufacture long-lasting comestibles and find a way to efficiently stockpile enormous quantities of them. That's when Dan had a breakthrough. Because he'd been stuck on his robot, he was in need of a nudge, or maybe even a full-on shove in the right direction. Or in any direction, really. And here it was. This was it. Without even meaning to or knowing that he'd done it, John Henry Knox had given Dan a mission, a reason to build a robot. It was the last thing he'd needed. Besides, obviously, the thousands of dollars worth of materials. But then, fate intervened. Chapter 40. One day, Dan was walking through his kitchen. He glanced at the messy spread of newspapers on the table as he passed by, and his eye caught on a strange sight. It was an advertisement. And in big, bubbly, bright orange letters there was this: 99% off. Dan was curious. What store would ever offer such an insane deal? They'd be bought out of business within a couple hours. Reading the ad more closely, Dan saw that the sale was in honor of a nearby hardware store's 99th year in business, and quickly realized that the 99% must have been a typo. Surely it was supposed to have said 9.9% instead. But there was no fine print, and Dan just so happened to be in the need of a ridiculous and otherwise unaffordable amount of metal. Dan told his dad about the misprint, and they were in the car on their way to the hardware village within a few minutes. The manager wasn't happy about it, but when Dan's dad threatened to take the company to court, the guy gave in, so long as these brazen customers of his didn't buy too absurd of an amount of stuff. Dan and his dad bought an amount of stuff that was just shy of absurd. It took them 6 trips back and forth to get everything home. And with all the lumber he got, Dan's dad had some friends help him build a shed, plus a shelter for the brand new grill he'd bought for just $4. Now he could barbecue in the rain or sleet or snow, maybe even during a potentially apocalyptic megastorm. Dan, meanwhile, was in the basement with several hundred pounds of metal. He was building robots. Chapter 41. As soon as Dan's done with his story, I start asking questions. First, I want to know how many of his 18 robots he's already distributed. All of them? He says, explaining that he kept some for himself, then gave one to each of the Enginerds. Then I start asking him about just what the robots can do, besides, that is, fart out food cubes at speeds of nearly 100 miles per hour. Instead of giving me an answer, Dan says, I think we better go see Grieg. I led the way upstairs. Grieg's under the bed, right where I left him before. Not how I left him, though. He somehow managed to get both arms and one leg free from the bedposts that I duct taped him to. He's also put a handful of gashes in the bike lock around his neck. He turns his head when he notices me. I am Grieg, he informs me. I sigh, stand up, and turn to Dan. You want me to get him out? Dan shakes his head frantically. Then he looks around and spots the couple dozen holes that Grieg made in my wall yesterday afternoon. Some are square, the exact size of the food cubes. Other holes, like in spots where a handful of the cubes all hit close together, are much larger. Dan reaches into one of the bigger holes and feels around for a minute. Got it, he says, pulling out one of the brown-black cubes. Then he heads out into the hallway. Come on, he calls back to Jerry and me. We meet him in the bathroom, where he tosses the food cube into the bathtub. Then he motions for me and Jerry to take a few steps back from the thing. Once we've moved, he cups a hand beneath the faucet of the sink and, running the tap, gathers a tiny palmful of water. He doesn't carry the water over to the tub. Instead, he flings it from afar, flinching back as he does so. I'm about to ask him just what in the world he's trying to accomplish when there's a giant squelch! I turn to the bathtub. And here's what I see. Rice cakes, animal crackers, marshmallows, 1 pound of sliced turkey, half a cucumber, and 2 grease-stained takeout containers with General Noodles logos stamped on the front. Chapter 42. I point toward the tub. Fortunately, Dan knows what I'm getting at, because, honestly, just now, I don't think I'm capable of stringing together a coherent sentence. He says, Go ahead, it's safe. Jerry and I go and take a closer look. The first thing I notice about the food in the bathtub is the damage. Or I guess I should say the lack of damage, because, yeah, sure, the rice cakes got a bit beaten up. The ones at the very top and bottom of the bag have been smooshed into dust. But through the plastic packaging, I can tell that a handful of those in the center of the sack are perfectly whole. Same with the animal crackers. A couple camels might have lost their legs. A hippo might have been beheaded. Overall, though, the little bagged zoo fared incredibly well. The marshmallows, too, plus the turkey and the cucumber, and even those takeout containers. Everything looks about the same as it did when it went into Grieg's stomach, before it got squashed down into a tiny cube. It takes me a minute, but then I find my voice. Well, sort of. I say, this, and then I say it again. This. On my third try, I finally get it out. This is unbelievable. Jerry agrees, giving Dan a smile, a wink, a thumbs up, and holding his other hand out for a fist bump. Then someone says, It's beyond unbelievable. It's groundbreaking. A breakthrough component of a breakthrough machine. I turn and look and see John Henry Knox standing there in the bathroom doorway. He's got a gash across his forehead and a gleam in his eye. Chapter 43. What are you doing here? John Henry Knox, who, let me take a second to remind you, just waltzed into my house, across the kitchen, down the hall, and up the stairs, and all of this without first being asked inside, which I'm pretty sure is illegal. Looks at me disgustedly, he says, I came here to talk to Dan, not you. Okay, I say, and just in case he somehow doesn't realize it, I add, but you're in my house. I know, he says, giving me a look like I'm the crazy one. Then he turns to Dan. Dan, he says, you are the one building these machines, correct? Dan doesn't answer. He's gnawing his lip and staring at the wound on John Henry Knox's forehead. Wait, I say to John Henry Knox. You figured that out? John Henry Knox smiles his smug little smile. Of course! How? Well, I'm familiar with Dan's work, and Sphene was basically plastered with his signature touches. It helped as well that Dan has shown an increased interest in my analysis and theories as of late, in particular the problem of food gathering and storage in potentially inhospitable environments. John Henry Knox tips his head from side to side. Also, he says, the only thing Sphene wouldn't eat was radishes. I turn from John Henry Knox to Dan, back and forth and back again. It's annoying. No, it's infuriating. I know John Henry Knox is smart, but the fact that he so easily saw Dan in this non-radish-eating robot, it's just not right. If anyone should have known that Dan was behind all this, it's me. Me! I mean, I'm the guy's best friend. Okay, I tell John Henry Knox. All right. You came, you talked to Dan, now if you don't mind, we're pretty busy. I know, he says, and I sigh. Do you know everything? I ask him. Nope, he says. But I do know quite a lot, and I know that it would be wise for us to sit down and exchange some information. Jerry says, like about why your forehead's bleeding? Yeah, I say. And about how you got into my house? John Henry Knox answers Jerry's question first. That's why I came here, he says. He points it up at his forehead. Sphene! He is trying to get away, to get down the street, and when I tried to stop him, he resorted to violence. When I hear this, my insides form a giant knot. I look over at Dan, hoping he'll shake his head and say that, no, that's impossible. One of his robots would never do such a thing. Instead, he lifts up his t-shirt, and there, on his stomach, are a handful of purple-black bruises. Each of them is the size of a bunched-up robot claw. The four of us are silent for several seconds. Then John Henry Knox answers the question that I asked him, the one about how he got into my house. Also, he says, your front door was wide open. Chapter 44. I barrel by Dan and Jerry and John Henry Knox and head for the stairs, but before I'm even halfway down them, I find solid evidence of what I'm worried about has happened. Indeed, has happened. Kitty has taken himself out for a stroll around the neighborhood. The lamp that usually sits on the little table beside the couch is gone, and the extension cord into which it has been plugged for the past decade has been dragged halfway across the room. Across the room and toward the front door. Oh, wow, I say, heading that way. Okay. I close the door and immediately start calling out for Kitty. But that turns out to be unnecessary. I find the pooch pretty much immediately. He's sitting at the bottom of the porch steps, whining a tiny, high-pitched whine, and staring down at the pieces of shattered lamp littering our walkway. He looks up when he notices me, gives a little yip, like he's asking me to take over and fix this situation. Stat. Kitty? I go down to comfort him. This is what happens, I tell him, when you mix gravity and ceramic and cement. Kitty yips again. I know, I say, tugging gently on his left ear, which sounds strange, I know, but is the dog's favorite way to get petted. I start to clean up Kitty's mess for him, but only a couple seconds in, I sense someone else standing there. Or several someone else's. When I look up, the guys are all there, ranged side by side at the top of the steps. They look about as upset as Kitty. Dan's the one who breaks the news. Your back door's open too, he says. And I know it's coming next. I just do. And Dan says it anyway. Grieg's gone. Chapter 45. I'm ready to dash into the street and chase the robot down, but none of the other guys seem to think that this is such a good idea. Actually, it's mostly John Henry Knox who gives me this impression. "Please, Kennedy," he says. "Now's not the time to be stupid or rash, but certainly not both." Then he once again suggests that we sit down and exchange some information. This time he says it's imperative that we do so. "Really?" I ask him. "You really want to sit down while there's a bunch of these robots out there on the loose?" "Yes," he answers. "I do. We're only going to make matters worse if we go out there without any semblance of a plan." Dan gives me a look like he agrees with John Henry Knox. Jerry seems to, too. So we go inside and sit ourselves down around the kitchen table. Dan, being the one with all the information, starts the exchange. "The robots are primarily programmed to obtain and store comestibles," he says. "In order to do that, their brains, so to speak, are full of recognizable pictures of human food, fruits, veggies, bags of bread, boxes of crackers, everything. However, they also possess a rudimentary form of intelligence." "Meaning?" I ask. "Meaning," says Dan, "that they learn. They develop a sort of memory bank. The longer they're active, the larger this bank becomes." "So they can begin to converse?" says John Henry Knox. Dan bobs his head back and forth. "Sort of," he says. "They can say hi, tell you their name, tell you your name. After a certain amount of time, they could probably give you walking directions to somewhere close by or tell you how to perform some simple task." Dan pauses. "Also," he says, "they learn how to overcome any obstacles that might be preventing them from obtaining food." He sounds kind of scared saying this. I don't get why. John Henry Knox, though, seems to have an idea. He looks extremely excited. He says, "So they can gather in zones potentially inhospitable to human life?" I say. "What?" "Say, for some reason, humans can't go outside," Dan tells me. "Say they've got to stay indoors or even underground in a basement or a bunker because there are mega twisters or super hurricanes raging up above. The robots could be sent out and counted on to collect anything edible in a certain area. They can not only survive the storms, but, say, pick through the rubble of a fallen building to get at the refrigerator full of food inside." "Okay," I say. "Obstacles." I'm nodding now, finally grasping things, seeing how all these pieces fit together. "And then," I say, "when the bots get back, all you need is a few drops of water and boom, a bunker full of snacks? That's brilliant." Dan nods. And I wait for him to say more, but he doesn't. And it leaves me with the distinct feeling that I'm still missing something. Jerry looks a bit confused, too. Even John Henry Knox has his thinking face on. "So," I say finally, "Grieg and Sveen and all the others, they're gonna gobble up everything they can find, then come back to our bunkers and give it to us, right? Kind of like they're our own personal butlers or something? And then, once they're back, all we gotta do is—" I don't finish. It's because of the look on Dan's face. He looks straight up terrified, and he's staring at the gash on John Henry Knox's forehead again. "What?" I say. "What is it?" "I don't think it'll be that easy," Dan says. I think maybe the robots are learning to see us as obstacles, human beings." Oh. So that's the part I was missing. Oh, no. Chapter 46. Dan has some phone calls to make. Before we do a thing, he says he needs to get a handle on where all the robots are and what kind of state they're in. His plan is to call each one of the Enginerds. We leave him to it, and Jerry and John Henry Knox and I head into the living room and give him some space. I turn on the TV, but not because I actually want to watch it. I'm just trying to keep us distracted while we wait. The Channel 5 news is on, and I turn it way down so he can listen in on Dan. Every one of his phone conversations is more or less the same. First he asks each of the Engineers if they got the package yet, and then if he built the thing inside of it, or if the thing inside of it built itself, and if so, what happened next. Of course, there's always a little interlude when the guy on the other end of the line finds out it was Dan who designed, manufactured, and programmed the walking, talking, food-obsessed robots. Dan's side, though, goes like this. "Hey, Simon," he says. Or Rob, or Amir, or Alan, or Chris. Then, "Nothing much, how about you?" "Oh, really? Did you open it?" "Yeah, and then it put itself together?" "No, I'm actually the one who..." "Yeah, seriously serious." "Uh-huh, yep, yeah." "Well, thanks. Anyway..." "Oh, it did? I'm sorry to hear that. Wow, that's different. Oh, God." "Okay, thanks, Simon." Or Rob, or Amir, or Alan, or Chris. Once he's done, Dan comes slouching in to the living room. I can tell by his posture alone that the news he's got to deliver isn't good. "Almost everyone's bot is up and running," he says, eyes aimed down at the carpet. "And eating," he adds. "And..." He pauses to blow the air out of his cheeks. "Attacking." Still staring down at the carpet, he gives us some of the details. "Apparently, Chris's did the same thing as mine. Sucker punched him in the gut and ran out the door." "Oof," Jerry says. "Max has stomped on his foot. He's pretty sure the thing broke a couple of his toes." "Yikes," says Jerry. Alan got headbutted." "Ouch." Jerry again, obviously. Dan stops there. He goes on staring down at the carpet. Slowly, desperately, he shakes his head. And despite everything, the secrets, the lies, I feel bad for the guy. After all, he's still my best friend. And I mean, he did something incredible. And since then, yeah, sure, things have kind of spun out of control. But he did something incredible. He'd gone and one-upped us all. From now on, any project, any individual engineer tackled would pale in comparison to Dan's. I know it's not exactly the time to celebrate the guy's achievements, but I hate to see him like this. And so, in an attempt to cheer him up and stay as positive about the situation as possible, to find the silver lining in this big black cloud, I say, "You said almost everyone's." "Yeah," Dan says. "Edsley. He hasn't even opened the box." "And you told him not to," says John Henry Knox. "Of course," Dan says. "And Jerry's too," I say. "He's still boxed up out front." "So 16, says John Henry Knox. 16 robots. 16 hungry, violent robots, says Dan. The four of us are silent for a minute, and then I give voice to the question that's already there, crowding the living room along with us. "So, what do we do?" Chapter 47. We discuss our options. Should we call the cops? If we did, would they even believe us? And if they did believe us, what could they really do? Would a small town police force be able to deal with 16 of these robots? Also, how much trouble would we, or just Dan, get into once the cops knew that we had something, or okay, everything, to do with all of this? We decided to table the idea of calling the cops for a second. Then John Henry Knox fires a whole bunch of technical questions at Dan. Do the robots have an emergency kill switch? Answer, no. Would it be possible to wirelessly interfere with their programming? Answer, doubtful. Did Dan pre-treat the metal he used so that it would be less reactive to magnetization? Answer, of course. John Henry Knox heaves a sigh. Then, a beat later, his eyes go wide and his mouth drops open. I'm assuming it's because he just came up with some kind of amazing, foolproof idea to fix all our problems, and I feel a sudden surge of gratitude for the kid and his big, annoying, brilliant brain. But John Henry Knox doesn't say a word. He just sits there, stunned, staring at the TV. It's still tuned to Channel 5 News, and I look over just in time to see a thick black bar clank across the middle of the screen. A second later, steel gray letters pound onto the bar, and just before a shower of bright orange sparks obscures them, I see the letters spell out two words: Robots Attack.